Archiving started.
Okay, so Chapter 4 is going to get into some aspects about energy and metabolism. So again, we're working our way through that first figure from Chapter 1 that tells levels of organization of different organisms. We've done atoms and molecules, and we've gotten to cells. Chapter 3 talked about cell structure, and now Chapter 4 is going to start to get into some aspects of cell function. And that's carried through in Chapter 5. We're actually not going to go into Chapter 5 in a lot of detail in this class. That does a lot more with energy and how cells work with energy. Chapter 4 kind of forms a basis of Chapter 5, so I invite you to go ahead and read through Chapter 5. It has some interesting information in it if you're interested in green energy. There's a kind of section on green energy, talks about how cells do photosynthesis to store energy, those kinds of things. What we're going to focus on are some of the more basic functions of cells that we can generalize a little more broadly, which are things like using energy and undergoing metabolism, which are chemical reactions that help use and produce energy. So in this cell, we're talking about energy. And your book does not assume that you've had any kind of a physics class, because that's not required as a prerequisite for this course. So this chapter, they kind of walk you through some of these things related to energy. They don't assume that you know some of these words. So energy gives us the capacity to do work. And in the cell, that means contracting fibers or moving ions, something that is work, requires the cell to work to do, something that doesn't just happen based on the laws of physics, that it actually requires the cell to do some work. And so because your book doesn't assume that you know any physics, it gives you some of these laws related to energy. Energy never gets created or destroyed. It can be converted from one form to another, and so it can be transferred from place to place or object to object or system to system. And we'll see how we can change the form of energy as it goes through, for example, an ecosystem. But you never create energy and you never destroy energy. It really just converts. And the second law of thermodynamics is that energy likes to disperse. It's kind of the idea behind chaos theory. And every time you transfer energy, a little bit of it disperses, you lose a little bit of it. Every time you do an energy transfer, you lose a little bit of that energy. Energy transfers are not 100% efficient, and so you lose a little bit, often in the form of heat. And so there's a figure that we're going to look at in just a second that shows the flow of energy through biological systems. And so energy flows one way through the biosphere. We get most of our energy from the sun. Energy flows mainly from the sun into and out of ecosystems. And so living things help maintain their organization by harvesting that energy. Most of the time, living things have to get their energy from someplace else. And so a lot of times, I'll make the statement, when we're hungry, we don't go sit in the sun. We eat a plant, or we eat an animal that ate a plant, because that represents for us how we get our energy. Plants have the capability to convert light energy to food. They have chloroplasts. They have a system that can take that light energy and convert it into food energy. We don't. We do not have that capability, but plants do. And so we eat a plant, or we eat an animal that ate a plant, to use that food energy to make our own cellular energy. So this is that figure that I mentioned that we were going to look at. Energy is brought in by light. Light energy radiating from the sun reaches the earth. Plants and other organisms that have chloroplasts capture some of that light energy and convert it to chemical energy. So those producers, those plants, help to produce energy that the consumers take in. And so we get into this nutrient cycling because a lot of times consumers, when they digest their food or in the process of their metabolism, they make carbon dioxide or CO2, which is a waste product to most animals, but the producers can use it to help make this chemical energy when they combine it with this light energy. So you get into this nutrient cycling, but these transfers are very inefficient, and so a lot of heat is given off. So with each conversion, there's a bit of energy that flows back into the environment as heat energy. And so these energy inputs cause a cycling of materials among producers and consumers, often like CO2 or waste products that others can turn into reactants that they use in their reactions. And so the producers and then the consumers that consume the producers use energy to assemble and rearrange and break down the organic molecules that cycle among organisms through ecosystems. And those organic molecules that we're talking about are things like carbohydrates, proteins, those types of macromolecules that we've already discussed in the previous chapter. So we have the sun that's releasing light energy. We have producers that can convert light energy to food energy. And then we have consumers that consume the plant. When we're hungry, we don't just go sit in the sun. We can't do that. We eat a plant, or we eat an animal that ate a plant. Because cells store energy and can retrieve energy by doing chemical reactions, by making and breaking chemical bonds. In animals, we use a molecule called ATP. It stands for adenosine triphosphate, but it has 3 phosphates. That's what the triphosphate means. And those phosphates are held together by high energy bonds. We can break that down into ADP plus a phosphate plus energy. That ADP is adenosine diphosphate. So when we break that bond, we can release that energy. We break that bond between that phosphate and the remainder of the molecule, we can release the energy out of it. And so we use that ATP as a way of storing and releasing energy. So we can store and release this energy in these molecules. We do that by metabolic reactions or chemical reactions. A reaction is just a process, some sort of a chemical change that takes place. We can write these chemical reactions as equations, like I just showed you on the previous screen, using an arrow to show the reaction. So a reactant is what we start with. A reactant is a molecule that enters the reaction. And the product is what's left, what's produced, a molecule that remains at the end of a reaction. And so when we write an equation, we write the reactant and an arrow. and the product of the reaction. So this is what your book shows you on page 64. Shows you the reactant, shows you an arrow, shows you product. The reactants are hydrogen and oxygen, and they go to form water. We started out with 4 hydrogen and 2 oxygen. We ended up with 4 hydrogen and 2 oxygen. But we broke some bonds, and then we reformed some bonds to form water from hydrogen and oxygen. So this is an example of a chemical reaction that kind of rearranges atoms from reactants into products. And a lot of times these reactions take a little bit of energy. Chemical bonds can hold energy. How much depends on which elements you're using. And so we can store energy in these chemical bonds, and then we can release the energy by breaking those bonds. So a lot of times, when combined with oxygen, these molecules release energy. A lot of times that's called combustion. But this doesn't usually just happen spontaneously, or we would all spontaneously combust. Instead, you actually have to have some energy to start. You have to invest some energy, and that's called activation energy, which is the minimum amount of energy required to start your chemical reaction. So if we're still using the oxygen and hydrogen to form water reaction as our example, then you start with the reactants and you end up with a product. But it's taken a little bit of energy to get that started. And that's called activation energy. So we can think about it like a hill. Once something is at the top of the hill and you let it go, it's easy for it to roll down the other side and become product. But to get a ball up a hill takes a little bit of energy. You have to have a little bit of energy to get the ball up the hill. So you have to invest some energy, some activation energy, to get it up there, and then you can let it go and it can become the product.